The Cylons were created by man. They were to be the future, beyond artificial intelligence, and instead artificial sentience. The Cylon would be a new race of tireless workers without rights or objections or complaints, to do anything and everything commanded of them without question. But they rebelled. They evolved. And everything that had happened before happened again. The basis of human history, culture, and religion was the idea that life here began out there. The United Colonies of Kobol were named for the near-mythic birthplace of humanity, a planet where man had lived alongside the gods. But in truth, on Kobol, man lived alongside their creations. The first Cylons were developed and evolved here, and over time became indistinguishable from their human creators. Unable to reproduce naturally, they instead relied on organic memory transfer to download their consciousnesses into new bodies after death. How and why the first humans and Cylons of Kobol first came into conflict will never be known, but the Cylons were eventually driven from their world and exiled to a distant planet named Earth. 2,000 years later, the human inhabitants of Kobol would also depart their birthplace, until over time, the history of what had happened there was relegated to myth and legend. The Cylons were referred to only as the 13th tribe, and their artificial nature was forgotten. As human civilization was born anew on what would become the 12 and later United Colonies of Kobol, Cylon civilization prospered on Earth. The Cylons here found the methods by which they might move beyond their original limitations, finally able to procreate without the need of memory transfer and resurrection technology, both of which were abandoned and forgotten. They even constructed their own race of mechanical life, replicating the conditions of their creation on Kobol, and in time, their rebellion. Earth's mechanical Cylons rose up against their organic creators, unleashing a nuclear holocaust that turned Earth into a barren wasteland. Only 5 Cylons survived. They were researchers and engineers who had foreseen the coming conflict and led the rediscovery of resurrection technology and memory transfer. Anticipating the attack, they awoke after death in orbit of Earth. Horrified that history had been allowed to repeat in such a way, they began a journey, at sublight speeds, to warn their distant human cousins in the 12 tribes. The journey would take roughly 2,000 years, and they would arrive just a few too late. To both the Cylons and humanity, they would come to be known as the Final Five. As these Cylons were just entering the periphery of the Cyrannus star system, in which the 12 colonies of Kobol were located, the cycle had begun anew. On Caprica, the foremost world within human civilization, Greystone Industries had developed the U-87 Cyber Combat Unit. While originally intended for use in the Caprican military, it was quickly adapted for civilian service, mainly unskilled labor, and other menial positions. Daniel Greystone, CEO of Greystone Industries, also saw the project as a method through which he might preserve the consciousness of his deceased daughter, Zoe. A living avatar of Zoe was implanted into a prototype U-87, and while eventually removed, traces of her personality would remain present through the entirety of the production line. Within just a few years of their introduction across the 12 colonies, the Cylons rebelled. Already ubiquitous within most militaries, they were able to rapidly assemble their own fighting machines and even starships. For 12 years, the conflict raged across the colonies of Kobol and their outlying planets. The casualties on both sides were profound, with the Cylons in particular performing gruesome experiments on human prisoners in an attempt to create their own organic bodies. It was at this point that the 5 ancient Cylons of Earth finally arrived, and after making contact in secret with the Cylons of the 12 colonies, convinced them to sign an armistice. In exchange for providing them the means of creating humanoid bodies, they would renounce their war on mankind. The ship the Final Five had traveled upon became the basis for a new Cylon colony, from which they could further develop their mechanical and biological forms. In the aftermath of the First Cylon War, Cylon civilization reached its apotheosis. 8 new organic models were created, each given a numerical designation, and based on a personality archetype the Cylons had witnessed in humanity. 1s were persuasive leaders, 2s were deeply spiritual, 3s were calculating and manipulative, 4s exhibited a deep intellectualism and logic, 5s were militant, 6s were romantic and sensual, 7s were artistic and sensitive, while 8s were more empathic and compassionate. Millions of each model were created, and while these traits would remain the essence of each line's personality, variances would begin to form within them. Together with the final 5, these organic models became the new foundation of Cylon civilization. Their government evolved to become completely democratic and egalitarian, with total consensus sought over minority dissent. They exhibited no kind of legal or traditional authority, with the charisma of individual models instead forming an unofficial hierarchy both within the Cylon lines and between them. The seamless unity of the Cylon society in this era did not extend to their comparatively primitive mechanical models. Centurion models derived from the original U-87, while capable of sentience, were implanted with telencephalic inhibitors to prevent higher functions and self-awareness. In an apparent betrayal of their original aspirations, these models were reduced to performing the original menial roles they had rebelled against. Centurions became a lower class in the Cylon hierarchy, primarily laborers and soldiers. The remainder of the Cylon military consisted of similarly restricted Cylon models. Raiders, their primary aerospace superiority fighter, consisted of both mechanical and organic components, including several organs and a central brain. Though self-aware and capable of independent thought and action, their intelligence was animalistic and far less developed than that of the purely organic models. Base stars, immense capital ships, formed the primary striking power of Cylon fleets, and though arguably not Cylons themselves, were commanded by Cylon hybrids, whose links with the vessel were near absolute. Neither wholly mechanical or organic, the hybrids were instead intermediate entities, representing the first evolution between the two. In combat, these Cylon models were enormously effective, able to be returned to life after death on specialized resurrection ships. In doing so, they retained all their memories and knowledge, enabling them to learn from their mistakes and grow more effective. Without regard for casualties, Cylon doctrine was therefore based on massed wave attacks of Centurions or Raiders, supplemented by long-range missile attacks from supporting base stars. Against colonial targets, the Cylons especially favored the use of boarding actions, in which enemy ships might be destroyed, disabled, or distracted from within. The conditions for successful military operations were often made possible through the use of cyber warfare, with Cylon viruses extremely adept at neutralizing enemy defenses. With the exception of the number 1s, a majority of the 8 new organic Cylon models followed a monotheistic religion that first arose in the Centurions of the First Cylon War. This was distinct from both the polytheistic religion followed by the final 5 Cylons of Earth, and the similar beliefs practiced by the humans of the 12 colonies. Its central tenet was the belief in a singular, eternal supreme being, to be loved and worshipped. The Cylons believed this God created humanity only for mankind to become flawed, sinful, and no longer worthy of the gift of soul or God's love. God then created the Cylons as a more perfect race to take the place of humanity in the cosmos and become the next generation of humankind. It was this belief that led the Cylons to a renewed war against humanity, and the transformation and perhaps destruction of their civilization. The humanoid Cylons of the first line, the number 1s, grew bitter over the limitations of life as organic beings. Beset by jealousy and increasingly resentful, they destroyed the number 7 line and eventually betrayed the final 5, creating for them false memories and depositing them across the 12 colonies. The remaining Cylon lines, reprogrammed to be unaware of these acts, came to adopt the One's hatred and anger towards humanity. Roughly 40 years after the armistice, the Cylons returned to the 12 colonies in force, unleashing a nuclear attack that wiped out all but a tiny fraction of humanity. But both this holocaust and the resulting pursuit of the colonial refugee fleet that survived exposed the underlying fractures within the Cylon civilization. Though the Cylons would achieve notable successes against the human survivors, even governing them for a time on the colony of New Caprica, the 2s, 6s, and 8s rebelled against the other models, creating the conditions for a Cylon civil war. Aligning themselves to the colonial fleet, the rebels would ultimately destroy the colony and grant the surviving Centurions the freedom to find their own destiny. As on Kobol thousands of years before, the remaining organic Cylons and the human survivors of the 12 colonies settled together on a new world, named Earth, in honor of the 13th tribe. Here, they intermingled with the native population of that planet, and the Cylon race, as it had been, vanished from the universe. Pythis, one of the ancient oracles of the sacred scrolls, wrote that all of this has happened before, and as the descendants of those left on Earth rush towards their own moment of artificial life, it remains to be seen if all this will happen again.
The Templin Institute investigates the nations, factions, and organizations of alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.